I want to start this episode with something that might change the way that you think about consent. Consent is not a teenage conversation. It's something we introduce at 14 when relationships start to happen. But that's not how it should be. Don't wait for it to get complicated. It's not a one-off talk about sex. It's not a list of rules we hand our young people and hope they remember in the moment. Consent is something that we begin teaching about 3 years old. Whether it's at the dinner table, the front door when a relative arrives, in the bath, in the playground, in every small, ordinary moment where a child learns or doesn't that their body belongs to them. And that no means no, regardless of who is doing the asking, and that how they feel about being touched matters. By the time we get to a teenage conversation about sex and relationships, consent should already be language that a young person has been speaking about for nearly a decade. Those kind of words should already be familiar, and the principle should already be lived. The problem is that for most young people, it isn't, because nobody told their parents to start at 3. Nobody explained that in the moment you tell a child that if you have to hug someone if you don't want to, you taught them something about whose feelings matter in that physical interaction, and it wasn't theirs. Today, we're going to talk about consent from the very beginning, what it looks like at 3, at 7, at 11, and at 15. What it teaches children about themselves and what happens in the most human and heartbreaking way when parent realizes a conversation they hadn't got around to yet suddenly becomes urgent overnight. I'm Ashley Costello. This is the Resilient Kid podcast, and this is Teaching Consent from the Start. I want to tell you about 2 families. So the first family I'm going to call the Smiths. Very inventive. Mum is Sarah, dad is Daniel. They have 2 children, Poppy, who's 9, and a son called Ruben, who is 5. And they are really thoughtful parents. They the kind who read things, ask questions, turn the radio off and have conversations in the car. And when they came to us, it wasn't because anything had gone wrong. It was because Sarah had been listening to this podcast, earlier episodes in the season, and I'd realised with a start that they had been talking about bodies and puberty with their children, but never talked about the principle underneath it all. Sarah said to me, "We've talked about what bodies do, but we haven't talked about who they belong to." And that was one of the most precise things a parent has ever said, because it is that gap, exactly that gap, the information about bodies without the framework of ownership and autonomy is incomplete. It's a map without a compass. So the second family, I'm going to call the mum Nadia. Nadia came to us in a very different state than Sarah. She was not thoughtful or prepared. She was shaken. Her daughter Chloe was 13, and 2 weeks before Nadia came to see me, Chloe had come home from school and told her something that had turned Nadia's world upside down. A boy in Chloe's year had been sending her messages, pushing her to send photos, telling her that if she liked him, she would, telling her that everyone did it, telling her it was no big deal. Chloe hadn't sent anything, but she had almost. She'd been on the edge, and not because she wanted to, but because she didn't have the language to name what was happening. She didn't have the words for the feelings that something was wrong. And she didn't have the framework to say clearly, even to herself, "This is pressure. I don't have to respond. And what he's doing is not okay." She'd come home, told her mum, not because she knew it was wrong, but because something felt off and she didn't know what to do with that feeling. Nadia sat across from me and said, "Why didn't she just say no? Why didn't she think she could say no?" And I said, as gently as I could, "When did you teach her that she could say no?" And the silence that follows was not comfortable for either of us in the room, but it was honest and it was the beginning of something important. So let's have a look at the research. We're going to come back to our stories in a little while, but I want to go into and just spend a little time on the research here because evidence around consent education is compelling and very specific, and it tells us the kind of things that should change what we do at every age. So let's start from the beginning. Body autonomy, the foundation of consent, begins at toddler age. Research, the NSPCC Speak Out, Stay Safe program from child safeguarding practices is consistent on this point. The earliest and most effective education is not about sex. It's about ownership of the body. It's a conversation that happens when a child doesn't want to be hugged and an adult insists. When a child doesn't want to be tickled and somebody continues to do it, even over their protests. And this is a hard one, even when a child is told to give grandma a kiss, whether they want to or not. These are the small moments that feel very harmless that we probably don't even think about. But what they teach is what they lay down in our children's nervous systems before they have the words to understand it is the feelings of others about their body matter more than their own feelings. That saying no is not enough. The obligation to be polite, to keep others comfortable and happy overrides the right to say, I don't want this. Now, there's a Professor Liz Kelly's research on the continuum of sexual violence is important here because she argues that sexual violence doesn't emerge from nowhere. It exists on a continuum that begins with the normalization of small boundary violations. The ones that we're talking about, the unwanted hug, the tickling that continues, the social pressure to perform physical affection. Teaching children from the very early stage that no is real and respected, that's prevention. It's not dramatic. It doesn't require a formal lesson, but it happens in the small moments every day when a trusted adult says you don't have to. I'm just going to pause here. I can remember at least 3 incidents when I was young. So one was with my grandparents' neighbour, who was a lovely elderly gentleman. He would have been the similar age. He was a widow. He did things for my grandma and granddad, and my grandma used to cook him dinner a couple of times a week, and really nice old gentleman. And I used to quite often, from an early age, take his dinner in on a little tray, and there would be pudding and all of that. And as I got older, I remember going in this one time and he said to me, oh, why don't you sit down? And so I did because I didn't think anything of it. And he put his hand on my knee. And at that point, I felt uncomfortable. This is a man I'd grown up with. This is a man who I was very fond of. This was a man who was respected in my family. And I remember the feeling changed. Hold on, this just didn't feel comfortable. Now, do I think he had any intention? No, probably not. However, I do feel that we have to get our kids to trust that gut instinct. And I remember never, ever going into his house alone again. Now, I don't remember at least saying to my grandma, I don't feel comfortable. I don't remember ever saying to her, he put his hand on my knee. But what I did do was say, I don't want to go on my own. And she never, ever asked me to go alone again. And that was a really important kind of turning point for me. And I'm trying to remember how old I was, and I'm not sure that I can, but I want to say I was 10. And I remember thinking at the time that it would have been really easy for my grandma to go, oh, go on, don't worry, it's just so-and-so next door. Or can you just do me a favour? And I probably would have gone. But the fact that I'd voiced and she heard and she listened and she never once asked me again, really underpinned that I could ask that kind of thing and I could listen to my gut because she also agreed. It wasn't that she was saying there was anything wrong or even that she probably suspected, but I think she just underpinned my feelings, and that was so important at that time. So important. So as children move into primary age, that consent conversation develops. So let's go back to the research. The NSPCC, their research on what protects children from abuse shows that children who have been explicitly told in age-appropriate language that their body belongs to them, that no one has the right to touch them in a way that makes them feel uncomfortable, and that they will always be believed and will never be in trouble if they tell a trusted adult something has happened, are significantly likely to disclose abuse when it occurs and significantly more likely to recognise it as abuse in the first place. This is a safeguarding argument for consent education that every parent needs to hear. We're not talking about sex when we talk to a 7-year-old about consent. We're talking about safety, their safety. We're giving him a framework to recognise when something's wrong before they even have a vocab for it, so that they can tell us when they need. By the time young people reach secondary school, the consent conversation does need to extend to relationships and sex. And here is the research is clear and it's urgent. Rape Crisis England and Wales publishes data that the majority of sexual assaults on young people are perpetrated by someone they know, not a stranger, a peer. A person who may have used the exact kind of pressure that we've just heard about Chloe experiencing, the relentless pushing, the normalization, that everyone does it. It's not a big deal because they have absorbed from culture and the absence of consent education that persistence is acceptable response to no. And I've had this conversation a couple of times this week. I'm just going to pause the research and tell you why. The conversations I've had this week were with primary school parents. So their kids are in primary school. And we were talking about boundaries and how important boundaries are. And the parents were like, oh, I know, but sometimes I'm tired and sometimes it's just easier. And sometimes I think, oh, why don't we just let them? Is it really a big deal? And I said to them, okay, so if your pattern is no, yes, whether it's sweets, whether it's staying up bedtime, whether it's extra screen time, and your children know that you might say no, yeah, at first. You might go, no, you're not doing that. Then you might say no again. But if they ask a third time, the likelihood is you're going to say yeah. They were like, yeah, probably. So I said, okay. So when they're older, at this particular age that we're talking about the research, when they're in their teens and somebody asks them to do something, in their brain, the pattern is set up for no, no, yes. Now, how important are boundaries? Now, how important is it when you say no, you mean no? Because it's not just your boundaries you're letting slip, you're teaching them that it's okay and that with persistence, we will let our boundaries down. And that changed everything for them. In that very conversation, boundaries make children feel safe, and this cannot be a better example of that. So when we, as parents, as educators, are keeping those boundaries with our young people, this is why, because we are saying to them, no means no. Boundaries keep us safe. Okay. The UK's government relationship and sex ed guidance introduced in 2020, I want to say, is now mandatory in all schools, and it includes a core component. Schools are required to teach consent But what schools can do in a 45-minute lesson cannot replace what a parent can do in a decade of small conversations. Finally, Dr. Nina Burrows' trauma-informed work on consent is worth naming here specifically. She makes a really good point that I want everyone to hear. One of the most common reasons young people do not say no, even when they want to, is they've never practiced it. They have never been in a context where saying no was safe and was respected or was received without a consequence. The parents who've been saying you don't have to hug grandma since the child was 3 have been doing something more important than they knew. They have been giving their child practice. Practice in using a word, practice in having it respected, and practice in the knowledge that no one is going to get them to change their mind. That practice is the whole thing. It can't be front-loaded into a single conversation at 15. It has to be built slowly, consistently from the very beginning. Okay, top tips. I'm going to do this kind of roughly by age. So teaching consent at every age. Okay, so 5 things. So 1, from the very beginning, respect their no. If your toddler or young person does not want to be hugged, kissed, tickled, respect it. This does not mean being rude, okay? It just means finding another way. And sometimes you're going to have to swallow your embarrassment, right? Because because why doesn't Poppy want to hug grandma? Do you know what? She's maybe not in the mood. Maybe it's too hot. That's okay. So we're going to have to swallow that rather than make them, okay? So you can just say, Poppy doesn't want a hug. Maybe she'd love a wave instead or a high five. Yeah, simple, dignified. It tells your child in the clearest possible language, because that's what's most important, not grandma's feelings right now, is that their feelings about their body matter and your no is respected. Top tip 2. Okay, primary age. Name the principle explicitly. Children between the ages of 5 and 10 can absolutely understand your body belongs to you. Nobody has the right to touch it in a way that makes you feel uncomfortable. And if somebody ever does, even if it's somebody you know, even if they say it's a secret, you will never, ever get in trouble for telling me. Say it more than once in ordinary moments, not in emergency ones. Make it a thread that runs through childhood, not a one-off announcement. It is particularly prevalent to have these conversations if you are in mixed company, if you are going to a party, if you are going on holiday with another family, if you're going to a big family gathering. It's really important. 3, preteen. Extend it to pressure and online. So before secondary school begins, ideally 10, 11, have the conversation about pressure. Sometimes people try and make you do things by making you feel bad or look bad if you don't, or everyone else is doing it. That's called pressure. And that pressure is never a good reason to do something, particularly if your instincts or guts are saying no. Name online pressure specifically, because in this day and age, that's where most of it will come from. 4, make it mutual. So by the time young people hit their teens, the consent conversation needs to include both directions, the right to say no and the responsibility to hear it from others. Consent means that everyone involved genuinely wants to be there and is free to say no without any bad choices or consequences. If someone seems uncertain, goes quiet, changes the subject, that is not a yes. A yes has to be clear and it has to be free. This is the conversation Chloe needed before that boy sent his first message. 5. And by the way, that's no judgment on Chloe's mum. You don't know what you don't know until you do. 5. After something has happened, it is never too late. If you're a parent who's just had their own Nadia moment, a child has come home with something that has made you realise the conversation didn't happen enough, please hear this. It is not too late. The conversation you have still matters. The message that's what happened is not okay, that they were right to tell you, and that their no was real, even if it wasn't heard. That message will still land. Start now and start from where they're at. I have a conversation this week with a client's mom, and we were talking about them going off to university. In fact, I think they're going away with friends first. And I said, have you had the conversation around just different areas? And have you had the secret word? And she said, oh, yeah, we do have that, but we've not used it for years. So I said, maybe now, as old as they are, is a good point to reiterate it. So we have a secret word. It's not this, because obviously I'm not going to give that out on the airways. I have probably mentioned it before on a podcast, but we have a secret word. So let's say it's banana. And one of my kids is at a party and they text me or I ring them and they say banana. I just go and pick them up with no questions asked. And I think it's really important to have that with your child. That's not saying you might not pick up the conversation the next day. But in the moment, in that night or that time, no questions. Just pick them up so they know they're safe. You're not going to kick off. You're just going to pick them up. Whether that is they have had a drink, they have tried some drugs, whatever that is, knowing that you are their safe port of call and you want them to ring you, that's what has to come. So that's why I'm saying to you, have that with your kids. And it doesn't matter if they're on a play date when they're little or they're at university at a party. You need to be their backup. So have that secret word, whatever it is. Okay, let's go back to the story. So back to the Smiths. Sarah and Daniel went home and started with Reuben, who was 5. They started at a birthday party, kind, with a distant relative who expected a hug and a kiss on arrival. And in the past, Sarah told me she would have nudged Reuben forward. She would have given him the gentle, as we do, parent push. Be polite, give a hug. She never even thought about what she was teaching him. This time, she crouched down and said, you don't have to if you don't want to. Would you like a wave instead? And Reuben looked at her for a second, then he waved. The relative smiled. Nothing was damaged, something was built. It took about 5 seconds, Sarah told me. I don't know why. I never did it before. With Poppy, who is 9, they'd had a longer conversation. Not a formal one, nothing scripted or sat down, just in the car, as they often did. And when kids are often at their best, when we're not staring them in the face, Sarah told Poppy that her body belonged to her. She never had to hug or kiss somebody she didn't want to, not even family. That if anyone ever touched her in a way that felt wrong, she would never ever be in trouble for telling Mum and Dad. And Poppy was quiet for a moment, and then she said, even if it's someone we know, especially if it's someone we know, Mum says. Sarah said she had to breathe through that way because the fact that Poppy had asked that particular question told her that some part of her daughter had observed something that Sarah hadn't intended to teach her. That she'd known people were different, that the rules were different with people you were supposed to trust. They aren't. And the work began there. Nadia's journey was harder, slower, and for the mum and the daughter, more painful. After that first session, she went home, sat with Chloe, not to interrogate, not to go through what had happened and why she hadn't said no or whether she understood how serious it was, but just to sit. She said, I'm really glad you told me. I want you to know that what he did was not okay, none of it, and you did nothing wrong. Chloe cried. Not a little, the kind of crying that's been waiting in the wings to come out. In the weeks that followed, Nadia and Chloe talked about what consent actually meant, about the pressure, about the difference between wanting something and going along with something, and about how sometimes we don't say no because we want to say yes, but because we haven't given enough practice in having our no respected. about how none of it was Chloe's fault. It wasn't anybody's, except the boy who pushed and the culture that taught him that pushing was okay. Chloe asked, somewhere in the middle of it all, why didn't anyone tell me this before? Nadia didn't have the answer, and she told me that later in tears of her own. But she had one thing for me. I'm telling her now, and that's got to be at least 5 years before any of this really matters in the way it nearly mattered. So I'm going to use them. That is all any of us can do. Use the time we have, start where we are, and trust that it's not too late, because it isn't. So let's have a look at the bigger picture. And I want to say something clearly because I think it needs to be said. Consent education is not about teaching them to be afraid of other people. It's not about making sex seem dangerous or relationships seem threatening. It's not about removing trust or innocence from childhood. It's about giving children fundamental thing that parents can give: the knowledge that their body belongs to them, their feelings matter, and that the adults in their life will always take their side. The stats around sexual harassment and assault amongst young people in the UK are not comfortable reading. They're horrific. The Rape and Crisis England and Wales data shows that 1 in 4 women in the UK has been raped or sexually assaulted as an adult. 1 in 4. The End of Violence Against Women Coalition reports that a significant proportion of those assaults occurred during adolescence. The Ofsted review we talked about in episode 1 found that sexual harassment amongst young people in schools had become so normalised, young people had stopped reporting it. These are not stats about monsters or strangers. They're about the ordinary young people in ordinary schools who did not have the language to name what is happening to them, who did not have the framework to say this is wrong, from a culture that never quite said it clearly enough. The pressure, the persistence, the going along with things are just part of growing up. They're not, and they don't have to be. The Lucy Faithful Foundation, which works on prevention of sexual harm, is clear. The most powerful intervention in early education is not just for potential victims, it's for everybody. For the boys who need to hear as explicitly as the girls that no means no, that going quiet means stop, that enthusiasm is the only version of yes that counts. For young people who are not sure where the line is because nobody ever drew it for them. Consent education from toddler who does not have to hug grandma to the 15-year-old who knows that pressure is not a reason to do anything. That's where the work is. It's the quiet work, the daily work, the little small conversations. It doesn't have to be dramatic, but it saves people. I want to end this episode by going back to something that Nadia said. She said, why didn't anyone tell me this before so I could have told her? That question stayed with me because it's the question underneath this whole season. And the whole reason we came to this was because a very good friend of mine said, I feel so embarrassed and so uncomfortable in having these conversations with my young son that we need to do something about it. And so that's why we do this. That's why we're having this long drawn out conversation around sex and the education that comes with that, about our bodies, about the anatomy of our bodies, about the pleasure, but why we need to get over this uncomfortable feeling and start to put some of this stuff in for our kids now. Irrespective of age, it's not too late. The answer to why did we get through our own childhoods without the words, without the framework, without the map is complicated, but it's nobody's fault. And at this point, it's besides the point because we know now. Knowing is enough to start. You don't have to have a Nadia moment to begin this conversation. You don't need to do something to have something for it to go wrong to start something. You just need to start young where you can, whether it's a 5-year-old who doesn't want to hug somebody, and the willingness to crouch down and say, you don't have to. That's the beginning. And as we keep discovering in this season, it is everything. That's teaching consent from the start. Thank you for being here for this one. I know it's not always easy listening, but it's necessary, and so are you. The next episode is the parent guide to talking about sex. Oh, here we go, the big one. The one many of you have been waiting for and probably dreading in equal measure. So don't miss it. All the research references, age by age guide, and further support resources are in the show notes below. If something in this episode has brought something up for you or your child, please reach out either to the organisations listed or to us here at The Resilient Kid. We'll always be happy to support you. Until next time, start the conversation. You don't have to get it perfect. You just have to begin.